Hey BookTube! I am the Book Mage and welcome to today's video, which is a very long overdue reading wrap up for like the past, I don't know, like couple of months. I feel like this is March, April and May, although I didn't really do very much reading in April. Also, I will say, I don't often wear red, and like this even has like a big mage hood as well, and I don't know whether I'm giving like D&D like red mage vibes or whether this is like more Scarlet Witch because of the hair. But I feel like I'm giving very much evil magic lady, and as the book mage I guess that very much is my vibe. I think I'm just learning that I should wear red more often. But yeah, vote in the comments below. Should I shave my head? So yeah, welcome to this, you can tell by my roots, very long overdue wrap up. I feel like maybe I should have kept the hood up, because this is a mess, but when am I ever not? For some reason I am looking very dishevelled, but it's fine, it adds to the look. So yeah, my whole keeping track of reading didn't work. I think I'm just coming to terms with the fact that April is just a bad mental health month for me, and probably will be every year in perpetuity. So I feel like my reading was going pretty good in March, horrible in April, and then I've kind of tried to pull it back a little bit for May, but honestly, this is a very sparse wrap up to say that it's like basically like 2 months / 3 months, because I think I only have 5 books to wrap up, so it's not going to be the best, but it is what it is. So, starting off very strong though, the first book that I read was The Broken God by Gareth Hanrahan. This is book 3 in the Black Iron Legacy series, and this is one of my favourite, still ongoing fantasy series to date. I just love it, I adore it, very much my vibe, and I'm very glad to say I'm now caught up with this series. I feel like the vlog where I read this was so long ago. I feel like my knowledge of what I was going to say about this book way back when I read it has probably slipped away a little bit in the months between like then and now. What I will say is I still love this series. I thought this was an interesting direction for the series. Without any sort of spoilers, for the very first book, it opens following a gang of like these 3 thieves, and they're sort of on their way to pull off a bit of like a heist, I guess, which goes horribly wrong. They end up sort of split up, and the consequences of their actions sort of snowball catastrophically across the city that they're in. And it has a lot to do with like dark religion and old gods. There's this thing in the background at all times going on called the Gods War, where actual literal gods just like come like fight it out on the battlefield, annihilating basically anything they touch. So stakes are high. It's a very weird, wonderful, whimsical sort of grimdark book. It is very dark, but I feel like it's just so punchy and fast-paced, and it's dark in a very good way. I feel like I'm giving those vibes today, but like it reminds me a lot of like a sort of grimdark D&D type session where like the magic and the alchemy of the world, it's sort of like weird and nebulous. There isn't really like a hard or fixed magic system in this, but given that you're dealing with like deities beyond comprehension, it sort of works really well in the book's favour. So if you like weird, wonderful creatures, like interesting, almost unexplained sort of like magic systems, fantastic dark religions, and like a pretty wide cast at this point of characters, highly recommend this series. I will not shut up about it. I talk about this series all the time and I will continue to do so. But yeah, this took things in kind of a new direction, and there's so many good things about this book that I would love to share with you, but I cannot because of spoilers. What I will say is, this book has 2 of my favourite things in books in it. I can't tell you which 2 because it might be a spoiler, but if you think we have similar taste in books, please give this series a go. By book 3, the stakes are so incredibly high. I will say, this book is so worth it for the very last line, because just, I so hope we get more books in this series. I think it was initially planned to be like a trilogy, but I believe the author intends to write further in this universe, although they have come out with a new book series since then, which is on my immediate TBR pretty much. Yeah, I hope to see so much more from this world and these characters, and again, the sort of cliffhangers that we're left with, it's just, oh, it's delicious. It's a feast for my little fantasy living brain, if we're perfectly honest. But like, the last line, if you've read this series, if you've read this book, how did you feel about the final line of the book? Somebody please talk to me about it. How did you feel about it? Yeah, I think I ended up giving this like a 4 stars. No book in this series so far has got a 5-star from me, but I feel like the series is like greater than the sum of its parts, because as a whole, the series as a whole is one of my favourite fantasy series of all time. So take that as you will. Hopefully that's been a glowing endorsement. I love this series. I will one day do a standalone video like I did for the Under the Northern Sky series, just talking about specifically why I love this series so much and why I think you should read it. So yeah, I started off March. Really, really strong. And this was a continuation of a series as well, so I was just following up on like my yearly goals. And on that same note, I continued to follow up on my yearly goals. This next one was to read more vampire books, and so I picked up Lost Souls by Poppy Z. Bright. This is the lovely, kind of stinky leather-bound edition that I like hand DIY'd into something that I thought made it look like a goth vampire bible, which I love. If you want to see that video, it's somewhere over here. Do I not? Sorry, I just have to... I'm definitely about to get you to join like an evil magical cult, right? I'm definitely trying to get you to sign away your soul. Like, please sign away ownership of your souls in the comments section below. It's early, but like, leave me like a little like, I don't know, flame, hellfire type emoji if you think that like, if I turned up at your door like this, could I get you to sign away your soul for some sort of like dark magical promise? Let me know. Feed my ego. So onto the book. Lost Souls is it's a vampire book from like the early 90s, I think like 91, 92. This was interesting. So I had many years ago initially picked this up. Actually suggested to me by a friend because they knew that I liked vampires and gothy, dark things, edginess. You know, I was a teenager. And so she lent me a copy of her book, and I got partway through it and I remember just like really not vibing with it. I think she ended up like taking the book back because I wasn't enjoying it, so I never finished it. So I figure this year, what with me reading vampire books, I would finally cross this bridge. Not so glad that I did. This what are the major themes of this book? I guess maybe like, if I say found family, that is a multi-layered, if I say found family, multi-layered. Yeah, the basic kind of plot of this book is that there's a very young like teen vampire. I think he's in like his mid-teens, I think. His name is Nothing, and he leaves home because he's angsty emo teenager and he doesn't know that he's a vampire. He just does not feel connected to anyone around him, and he is just deciding to run away from home and set out on his own to like find somewhere that he belongs, I guess. At the same time, there's also a group of, I hate them so much, there's a group of 3 vampires driving around just drinking, partying, sleeping around, eating people. The epitome of all hedonism, I think. They're basically just driving around America, doing their own thing, enjoying their immortal life, and being really gross about it. Just so gross about it. And then the last sort of like main group of people, there's a band called Lost Souls, with a question mark, and are they from Georgia? I can't remember where they're from. But there's 2 of them in this band, a guy called Steve, and if you've played Dragon Age Inquisition, he's basically Cole. Yeah, and he kind of has like these visions. He's very connected to like the paranormal and like the ethereal, and he's just sort of like floating through life playing songs with Steve at various bars. And there's also Steve's ex-girlfriend Anne. I can't talk about my feelings about Anne without getting into major spoilers, but what I will say about this book is that I'm not sure there's ever a moment where anything you're reading is very pleasant. It is a lot of shock value. It's written from like a sort of alternative point of view, and I mean that as in like alternative persons, like the alt scene, I guess, from back in the 90s, and so much of this is kind of like very punky feeling, kind of like gore and bodily fluids, and just sort of like touching on a lot of like the grosser, darker, more like icky, unpleasant parts about humanity and also vampires and like how they relate to humanity. So if I gave you trigger warnings for this book, there would be like one on every single page, to be totally honest, and I feel like it would spoil like most of the plot of the book. So I will say, if you have literally any triggers at all, don't pick it up. If you're like me and you don't have any triggers, go for it. That said, it was interesting to me to read it because I kind of like some of the vibe of where it's going, and there were points in this book where I was really enjoying, I guess, the writing and kind of just like the gross, gritty scubbiness of like what existence is like for these people in this book. But I will say, it's so hard for me to pick a single character that I like even a little bit, because it's like, if they're not a rapist, they're incestuous. If they're not incestuous, they're a paedophile. If they're not a paedophile, they're a murderer. And it's like, can I just have one character? The answer is no. Poppy Z. Bright said no. It was an interesting read for me, and I'm glad that I've crossed it off. I don't think I'm a massive fan specifically of this book. There were certain parts of it that I really, really enjoyed, but then so many other parts seemed to drag. And for a book that tries to get like really like icky and gross and in there with like what it must be like to be a vampire and be othered. I felt I just wanted so much more for it. We didn't really linger in any of like these dark, decrepit, depressing places. We seemed to move on very fast. Characters were just very nonplussed by so much of what was going on around them, and I mean that. Like, imagine getting the most disgusting, horrible, life-altering information that sort of any other normal person would be like, I should die about this, I should die about this. And all the characters are like, I guess, okay, that happened, and they just move on. And I'm like, is anyone gonna react to this? Yeah, I'm glad that I read it. I don't regret reading it at all, but I feel like it ended up balancing out at a 3 stars. I was so hoping that this might end up being more, especially because it really wasn't afraid to go anywhere multiple times. But like, I think my main gripe about this is because like, I can make my peace with like having all characters being morally great or even morally reprehensible. I'm fine with that. The way that female characters are treated in this book, if you know, you know, I just feel like there really are only like 1 or 2 female characters in this that have any page time at all. And they have like pretty much no agency, no effect on their own story. They're very much plot devices and just objects for the main characters who are all men to interact with. Having read this, I just feel like the way that one certain female character in particular was treated, and like, I know it's meant to be sort of like a tragic, gothic, horrible kind of story where good things do not happen to these characters, but it felt vindictive. It felt like there was real hate for this character that the author invented. They were like, fuck you in particular. Just reading it just kind of felt so weird because there was no balance. There wasn't like a single other female character, unless you count like a very old like grandma type lady who very briefly appears. There's like no female characters in this book that do not suffer incredibly and undeservedly. So it felt purposeful. I don't know if that was like a point trying to be made, but I'm not sure where we were going with it. So at least I have like this really nice cute edition though that will forever sit on my shelves and make all my books smell, because it smells like spray paint and leather. I was doing well at this point, and then at the end of March, the next book I picked up was the book I've been most excited for all year. The one where this all went wrong, but it is not the book's fault. And that is A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon. I'm gonna say right off the bat, just to get it out of the way, I ended up giving this 4 stars. I really enjoyed this book. I thought that the characters were fantastic. I really liked the story. This is a prequel to The Priory of the Orange Tree, which is, again, that's kind of basically like a feminist retelling of St. George and the Dragon. It's just really fascinating, and I can't really say more without sort of going into like spoiler territory, but I feel like if you're on this channel you probably have heard about this book, or Priory at least, and sort of know what it's about, at least vaguely. So I wasn't really sure what to expect going into this, and if you do want like more of my full sort of like ongoing thoughts, I do have like a full vlog up where I read this. I will say it is a disaster vlog. I had a tough time reading this, but it was about my own mental health and nothing to do with the book. I really love the way that Samantha Shannon writes. I love specifically the prose on the page and the way that she builds her world, and it just feels so cohesive and like realistic and lived in, and I really like that. And I kind of like the weird way that in a lot of like realistic history you might have these like parts of religions or beliefs or customs that you kind of have a vague idea of where they come from, but you don't know like the actual honest, truthful origins of the things that shape your life and your beliefs. And I kind of like how that plays into so much of like the fantasy element of these books. I really hope that Samantha Shannon continues to write like adult high fantasy, whether it's in this world or not. Still, despite all my struggles, still one of my highest rated books of this year. So, moving on from that, I figured I wanted to read like a short book, more of like a palate cleanser, and I also wanted to read some more vampires. So I picked up Vampire Weekend by Mike Chen, which is a new release. And this one follows an Asian American vampire called Louise. Her immortality basically consists of her enjoying various like musical artists, like going to a lot of gigs and playing at home on her own instruments. She's really into music, and one thing I will say about this book is I really liked the way that the author and like the character by extension sort of talked about music and their love of like music and instruments and like what music means to them. I will say this book felt like much more of a love letter to the music scene than it did anything to do with vampires. I feel like the vampire aspect of these books, while it played into the plot, I feel like it was very minimal on the vampiness. Like, you could have changed vampire to be another thing, like any other sort of like secret life or secret lifestyle. You could have swapped it out and this book wouldn't have necessarily had to really have anything to do with vampires. So much of like the vampiness that I expect, sort of like the introspection and the look at like how, like what a vampire is and like what that means and what they're metaphors for, didn't really come through all that strong in this book. But it is, again, it is very short and it is kind of like mainly a contemporary, and it's quite casual, and like, so ultimately it wasn't really what I was looking for in a vampire book. I'm still glad that I've read it, because like it was only a short read. I think this basically took me like just 2 days to read, but if you're in a better headspace than me, you could have totally read this in like just an afternoon, because it is very short. It's only like 350 pages, and I feel like most of the themes of this book focus around like, I guess, like how as an individual, like you choose your family, how you might deal with like family trauma, and like when to stay and when to step away. But mostly, I think the thing that I enjoyed most about this book was just the way it talked about music. Although I will say, considering that I thought this was going to be more about like alternative bands and punk bands and things, and it did touch on like, because Louise is a vampire, obviously a lot of these bands are, I don't want to say antiquated, because stuff like David Bowie, because in her time it would have been like much more alternative and less mainstream, but nowadays things like the Beatles and stuff are very, very mainstream, and so I thought we would get more on like sort of like niche punk rock and like metal bands, because that was sort of like the vibe that I got, given that she's like this rebellious child. But obviously if you were rebelling in the 70s or whatever, by the time you get to the 2020s, that music is all just very mainstream. It's kind of like, it's kind of like what your mum would listen to. So yeah, I guess of all the bands that got name dropped, a lot of them I was like, I know these bands, I know a few songs by them, but they're all very mainstream. Like it gets as mainstream as like, I think like Daft Punk is in there at some point. So yeah, it didn't quite go as alternative as I thought it would, but I feel like for a person who isn't, like, look at me, like I feel like for a person who isn't me, these bands might feel like they're sort of on like the fringes of like alt and like indie kind of stuff. It's not to say that they're not, I just kind of lean way more alternative and like heavier, I guess. I could definitely appreciate it, especially with like the sincerity of the author. Like I can tell that the author must really enjoy music and like wants to speak about music, or at least did like a lot of research. I really did like that. What I will say is, so much of this book I feel like was very straightforward. There wasn't really, and I feel like again it's because it's a contemporary. So much of what I enjoy in fantasy is like, I know there can be convoluted plot lines, but there wasn't really much to figure out in this book. There wasn't really any sort of like twists and turns. It was very much a very straightforward thing, and mainly all the sort of character growth was only really experienced by the main character. The other characters on the sidelines didn't really have growth. They were very single-minded. They were like, I've got a goal in mind, and then they just sort of went for it. And I thought there might be sort of like maybe like a bittersweet ending or something, but it really didn't go in that direction. And there is a character in this, without any spoilers, that the main character sort of, I guess between them they've got a lot that they would need to get off their chest. We don't get to see that discussion. Like, you know that it happens, but it happens off page, and it's like, where is my catharsis here? It's very much like stuff is wrapped up in a neat little bow without really being explored to the sort of level of depth that I would like. And I feel like when you're doing a vampire book as well, again, kind of like Lost Souls, I really want to linger in it. Like, give me the angst, give me, like, just really get in there, you know? Like, if you're gonna put a knife in, twist it a bit, you know? I liked it, I could appreciate it, but it ended up being a 3 stars because I feel like it's going to be very forgettable for me, I think. It's not going to be a book that I particularly think back on very much, but I feel like somebody will really like this book. Just sadly wasn't one for me. And then lastly, the last book I read, or shockingly, listened to, and that book was Waking Gods by Sylvain Neuvel. So this is the sequel to Sleeping Giants, which is I think it's a novella. It is quite short. It's a short sci-fi, and in the first book, basically a girl falls through like some woodland and lands in a hole, and she lands on like this giant outstretched metal palm, and it's kind of like, what is this? Where is the rest of this like big metal construction? Like, what is it? Where did it come from? Who made this? The book sort of goes from there. I guess it can be described as sort of like a first contact with aliens type thing. It focuses so much more about like humanity and like what we would do, how we would act, how we would react, and for some short little sci-fi novellas, I feel like they're quite good. I will say, I think I liked this one less than the first one. I like the way the story is continuing, and we're picking up from some of the cliffhangers of the first book. I like the raising of the stakes that we get in this book. I'm just not as invested in the characters and their actions. One thing that I didn't say during the first book, because it is a full cast audiobook, one thing I really like about this audiobook is that the range of accents we get I actually really like and really appreciate, because obviously this is like a global thing, so you have people from all over the globe and they're all speaking English, but they have it's the biggest variety of like very strong accents that I've heard in an audiobook to date, and I really like that. It's also really good for me not getting confused about which character is which, because they're all so easily identifiable by their voice, which honestly really great. The only one that kind of gave me a little bit of pause is there is a preteen character in this book, and I'm pretty sure they're voiced by like an adult woman, because you could get like a child voice actor, but I'm pretty sure they just used an adult woman for this. And on the one hand it kind of threw me because they sound much older than I guess they probably are, but on the other hand I'm thinking, would I want to listen to this audiobook if there were I had to listen to like an actual like preteen speaking in my ear? I would put it down. I am so glad that it doesn't sound like a child speaking, so I appreciated that. I will say there was one thing in this book that I really disliked, and it wasn't like an event or anything like that. It was just a societal way of thinking about certain things that I guess must match the way that the author thinks, or at least all the characters feel the same way, and it's kind of not even questioned. It's kind of like this is like the normal way of thinking, and it offended me so much. It made my skin kind of crawl. I was like, this is the exact opposite of how I as a human feel. So not seeing a single other person at all feel any differently was kind of like, why is this a foregone conclusion? Why is this and I don't want to say here because it's a very minor spoiler, I think, but I do discuss it in one of my reading vlogs, so that, and it's such a minor thing, but the way it kept coming back up, it made me angry every time. It made me feel uncomfortable every time, because like I understand that a lot of people in the real world probably do just feel that way, but it's the opposite of how I feel, and I feel personally offended that I have to assume that that is the default correct opinion. And I don't like it. I didn't like it. So I don't know whether I would rate this maybe like a 2 point something, just because of how much I really disagreed on that one point. I don't think I liked the development and the plot as much as the first book. Just one mark less than like a 3 stars. I just don't think it was as good as that first book, and it got on my nerves. So that said, I still do like it. I still do like the series, and I do want to continue. However, I have horrifyingly discovered that my library does not have the 3rd and final book, so I don't know how or when I'm ever going to get to listen to that. That's a problem for future me. So yeah, here was my little wrap up plus Waking Gods. This looks so small. Not my best wrap up, but I mean, series continuation, vampire, and series continuation. At least I'm like on track with my goals. So thank you guys so much for watching. I know that I already asked you guys to leave me a very specific emoji earlier, but if you did make it this far in the video, maybe also throw in like, oh my god, what can we have? Like a little vampire emoji, like a little bleh kind of Dracula kind of guy. And honestly, I have no idea what sort of like bookish question to ask you guys today because my brain's just dead. So maybe in the interest of just being friendly, I mean, we're so close to summer now, so do you guys have any sort of like fun summer plans? And will you be bringing any books along? I'm going to download soon, and I don't think I'm going to bring a book. I don't think I'll have time. So that's pretty much it for this video. Hopefully my next reading months will be better. So with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this wrap up, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye! But really though, give me your souls.